didn't decided not to wait for me. but but okay, so tell me, for those of you that did get a chance to look at it, even if you did was skim it, what jumped out at you from the reading? Did anything jump out at you, or?
They're talking about a lot about the Cold War, and they also talk about September 11th.
Yes. What did you make of that? Because he basically says that that was a turning point in terms of our understanding of violence, right?
Violence, yes. It
Yeah.
also talks about a lot about a little bit about Jesus and stuff, like Jesus Christ or something like that. Yeah, I was reading about it. That was introducing like introduce some of it.
Yeah. And I
I
think that,
understood.
mhm.
I understood from that that the pretty much how violence exists, and about like Jesus and how like both the worlds coexist without interfering in in each other.
Yeah, so let's start there. Yeah, with the coexistence of violence and basically the prohibition of violence, right? It is kind of funny, and this is one of the things that you always want to watch out when you do any of these readings. That it is this is a very like Christian Western perspective that he's presenting here. Like, why bring up Jesus? It's not, Christianity was not the first religion, not even the first one to say anything about violence. So one, it shows us the author's own biases, and maybe also the audience's biases, right? That he probably included that in there because he thought that's something that would resonate with people. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Yes, yes. So violence and that politics would coexist. So actually, let's take a step back a little bit. I'm going to share my screen. And whenever I use a PowerPoint, by the way, which I am going to do today, I always link it on Canvas. It's going to be under attend, and it's I always link it the night before, so that if anybody like wants to take a look ahead of time, or like I know some people like to have it printed and writing their notes as they go along, that you can do that. It's not a requirement, since I'm also recording as I talk through the Zoom. But I'm going to ask you to jump in with your thoughts as we go through some of this. So once, well, starting with kind of definitions of violence, and defining violence is kind of odd because it's something we all inherently feel like we know, right? Like we feel like, oh, this is a word, I know what it is. But it does come from the Latin word vis, right? Which means force or vigor, right? And this is kind of important when you look especially at older histories of violence, because a lot of times the word violence is not going to come up, but instead something like the word force will, right? Or vigor, or other words. And what they're really talking about is some form of violence, right? So one of the earliest like written definitions of violence that we have is from 13th century France. I am biased in that I'm a historian of France, but I'm like this is actually where we have one of the earliest written definitions. And in 13th century France, they thought of violence as somebody who was quick tempered, right? Someone who had a temper, someone who was a brutal person, right? Um, at the same time, even during the 13th century, it was also understood as a kind of power relationship, right? But also understood in a like one-on-one setting, right? As somebody having power over another person, right? Oh, and I'm seeing, I'll come back to those of you in the chat. Right. Oh, yeah. Some of you coming up with, there are older definitions. I mean, the oldest written laws we have talk about violence, right? So um, legally, though, there's something different about the way we might discuss violence, culturally, or um, politically, and then how we talk about it in legal terms. And for our purposes, the legal ways of defining violence will matter, right? When we talk about crime, and the way in which then crime intersects with the criminal justice system is really will be important. So a lot of times the way we are going to define violence, and it's going to be legally. So, and that will vary, right, across the world, across region and places. But we tend to think of use other words to describe different kinds of violence, right? Homicide versus assault and versus rape. right? And sometimes the way the legal system defines these forms of violence is can be really effective in societies in some way or another, and really ineffective as well. Right? When you think of like even like what is assault, you know, what might be assault to me if I feel assaulted might be something that is not legally, is not something you can't legally prosecute. We've really struggled in society with legal definitions of rape, because the way we define these things have a lot to do with what we think constitute what's wrong, right? Where we draw lines of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and we have really struggled defining what rape is and how to legally what's the appropriate punishments for those. Right, and so that's, and this is something that I think it's important to make some of these distinctions as we go along. And Jonathan Schell in that intro doesn't really get a whole lot into that aspect of it. So I wanted to make sure and include that here. Right? Somebody, I think it was Che on Monday, at the end of class was asking me, why did I start 19th century France? Why didn't we go back further, right? That Schell talks about some of this ancient history, and how violence was a part of society, and an important part of society. When we analyze a lot of documents from the ancient world, a lot of them do seem very concerned with war and conflict, right? Do you think, I'm going to go to the chat and I'm going to stop sharing really quickly just so that I can see your faces and let you talk. Do you think violence has always existed? Do you think it's inherent in
Yes.
humans?
Yeah.
Do-
Yeah.
Most
Yes.
definitely.
Yes.
Yes.
Violence has always existed, in
Apparently
my
so.
opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I think
I
about
agree.
violence, I think about that scene in 2001: Space Odyssey when those ape-like creatures figured out how to smash each other's heads with bones.
Yeah, okay. Yes, absolutely. And we seem very fascinated with it, right? One of our themes that we're going to be talking about in the first few weeks is also our fascination with watching and following violence, right? There's a reason why the movie 300 is still extremely popular. Right, and why a lot of these heroes from the ancient world have remained heroic in our eyes, right? On the screen, I have the picture of Brad Pitt as Achilles. Right, everybody, or a lot of people in Western Europe and the U.S. know who Achilles is. A lot of people all over the world, just because of his status as this heroic figure, right? But just to talk about, I asked you if you all thought it's inherent, and most of you seem to think so. A lot of it has to do, with how you feel about humanity. I think if you're a pessimist about humanity, you tend to think, yeah, we all have, the capability of violence. If you're a little bit more positive about humanity, you might see it a little bit differently. But it almost doesn't matter, though, what you think about human nature in a history class, because in a history class, we can't just chalk it all up to it's inherent, we're all violent, right? Because if that's the answer to every instance of violence, then what the hell are we doing? What is there to analyze, right? But you can still believe that. And what we want to do is that the kinds of violence that exist and how it's understood in societies will vary across time and space, right? That the location and the individuals, the groups involved, make instances of violence different, right? So that as you write your papers, I don't want to hear a whole lot of like generalizations about violence, right? Like people are violent or men are violent. We don't want to think and write like that, because it takes away a lot of the specificity of the historical moments that we look at. We want to be specific about, okay, which man is violent, which person is violent, or how is this society experiencing this. So like one example is in the ancient world, right? That for the heroes of the Homeric epics, right? And in the Greek world, what a lot of those epic stories tell us is that for them, war as a kind of violence was a way to attain glory, right? War was glorifying. especially for men in societies like in the different Greek city states. It was a way of attaining glory, right? It was not a bad thing, right? It was experienced as something good. Everybody wanted to be Achilles, right? And the thing that the only way to be like Achilles was to go to war, right? Now, the other thing I want to touch on is when you think of violence, do you think of it as gendered? Is violence primarily a male attribute?
No.
No, why not?
Primarily.
I think, well, I think if you're going to say that violence, well, like, basically, I think that like we're all aggressive, but we have different ways of showing it. So I think, you know, you could say that like men typically tend to be more like physically aggressive, but that's not to say that women aren't also aggressive.
Anybody want to add anything to that?
Yeah.
But
Oh, I know that Alexander's mother came from a tribe in Greek. I forget what it was called, but there were a lot of female fighters, and they were very strong. Like even the princesses were fighters in that era.
Okay, yeah, and then Cairo, were you gonna add something?
Yeah, I'm just agreeing with everyone. Yeah, I think there can be a level of violence that each gender can display on its own, but that's not singling out that, you know, the violence isn't necessarily gender specific, because everyone can they can do both. And yeah, what you're saying about the Greek and Romans, like there's Amazonians, if you guys believe in Amazonian women, like there's tribes in Africa that have warrior women, or there's women with no men at all. And as when I was reading the article, it was saying that, well, no, I think I'm mixing articles, but there's women who grow up and, you know, there's in war-torn worlds that have no men and they have to take care of themselves. So
yeah, no, so this brings you brought up a couple of really important points, so but that I want to kind of unpack a little bit. So one, I'm going to urge you to not think of or to search out how violence is gendered, right? How we do it, right? That society's gender, because gender is a social construct, right? When we talk about gender, I'm not talking about biology. I'm not talking about, you know, reproductive organs. I'm talking about the way we understand femininity and masculinity in society, right? So in that we get to define, in every generation, every country, every society defines it differently, defines masculinity and femininity differently, right? And so the key then is to understand, okay, how is it gendered in this particular time and place? When we look at the ancient world, we have evidence of female warriors, right? The Amazons are a great example. I'll share my screen again so you can see. I have a picture here from Wonder Woman epic, and then the original Wonder Woman, and then the most recent video, and how they depicted the Amazons, right? So these warrior women existed in the ancient world. We have archaeological and written evidence. The Greeks actually wrote about these women, but what was funny is a lot of the Greek sources that we have about these warrior women are totally like, clearly it was their imagination. They were not writing about the actual women. They saw warrior women and they immediately, like, their imagination kicked in. The way the Greeks wrote about the Amazon was about women who were warriors, and they imagined that these women had to cut off their breasts, because otherwise how would they wear the armor? How would they wear the protective shields if they had breasts? And so the Greeks just in their head just decided that obviously these women, because they're unnatural, they're not normal, they cut off their breast in order to be warriors. So they were kind of like viewing these women as outside of the normal, kind of defeminizing them, right? Taking away something that for them felt feminine, breast, and taking it away from them.
yeah, it brings up the point where women have to sometimes be more masculine in order to get recognition or any level of authority where it's a male dominated, you know, workspace. So for them, it's like, okay, this isn't working, you know, I have to be more, you know, So cutting off, that's crazy though.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
and we know that actually these warrior women did not do that. They did not do that.
Oh,
They
God.
didn't. So I should be clear. Yeah, this was all just the Greeks imagining them. The women did not actually cut off their breasts. It was just coming from societies where being a soldier was not equal to being a man, right? A woman could be a soldier, and if you're going to fight a successful war and you need all hands on deck, why not let women fight, right? Why? Like in some societies, it just didn't make sense. But and then the way we imagine them today, these Amazons, is also really weird and funny, because in some ways we have traditionally like over feminized these warrior women, right? Like the old picture of the way the Amazons looked in the older Wonder Woman TV show, the way like this kind of clothing would not make sense for warrior women to wear. Like, you're completely exposed. All someone has to do is stab you. There's nothing protect, no barrier there, right? Like, women weren't gonna go around fighting half naked. They just were not, and they did not, right? But we imagine them as such. They were also a lot of these societies of warrior women were not all women's societies. Right? Like in a lot of ways, in order to understand these warrior women, we created a completely fictional version of them, that they were all women, isolated, man-hating, when in reality they came from mixed societies where there were men and women, and they just happened to let women fight. It was not.
Dr. Cardona?
Yeah.
That idea of like the over feminizing the women, like that become more popular during this like era, or like just like a few years ago?
That's a good question. No, so because if you read up on the history of Wonder Woman, she was created by a man. He was in the 40s during World War II, or right before World War II. And so when they sat down to design her, it was a bunch of men sitting down to design her. So, and the Greeks, when they write about these Amazon women, they write about them in very these weird ways too, and it's all men writing about it. So it's existed for a long time, and it's probably a more of a result of the way men in patriarchal societies imagine these warrior women. Yeah, that's a good question. But no, I'm like, the man who designed Wonder Woman was a feminist. He knew Margaret Sanger, and actually he says that in order to understand Wonder Woman, you had to understand Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood. But then also, so in some ways she was like this, designed to be a feminist icon, but through the eyes of men. Right? It was this feminism filtered through the eyes of the men that designed her. Yeah, it's actually really interesting. All right, in the chat, some of you brought up, are politics and violence connected? I'm gonna stop sharing for a second so I can see you. Do you Shell says they are. He says they are. He says because he's looking at 20th century history, the world wars that define the 20th century, right? And then the Cold War. He says all that's politics, right? And violence is political in those settings. Interesting. So I think most of you, is anybody saying no or not always? You can raise your hand.
I'd say not in the past, before there was a system of government that existed.
Okay. I'm like, I was wondering, because you know what? I feel like a lot of you were going to say yes, and maybe because of the moment we're living in, where we just saw, a moment of political violence at the Capitol, and we've been seeing a lot of that kind of activity recently. So I'm like, for us, I think we want to say yes, because that's what we're seeing, right? A lot of the violence we're seeing is political. Interesting. Okay.
Would you consider gerrymandering to be a form of political violence, because you are like forcing your ideology like on people?
I think you can
like
definitely make that argument. Yeah, I don't know if I've decided if it is or not, but I think that you can make that argument, and there's the evidence for that. Most countries have defined borders as a kind of violence. I actually like that. Chavez Ravine, if it's really interesting. A lot of you are Dodger fans, and you know the history of Dodger Stadium. And I'm like, I'm like, if to be a Dodger fan, I think a lot of you have to put that aside and like divorce it from what your own political beliefs are. When you're like, oh, but I love the Dodgers, so we're gonna set that aside. What they did, displacing a lot of poor people to build the stadium. Um, and we will talk a little bit about borders and the nation state, how the nation state really ends up defining violence in the 20th century. When we talk about the world wars, we have to talk about, you know, the development of the nation state, the development of militaries by countries, right? Because they'd all been spending a ton of money building up their military, improving military technology. And so it almost was kind of like they were building the setting for the world wars, in that, and they had been practicing in the colonies how to successfully like use their weapons and their military. Yeah. Oh, the reservations, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So okay, so we're going to agree then that there is a connection between politics and violence, especially depending on the setting. Now, what if we talk about, like, we're going to start talking about serial killers? Is that political?
I watch a lot of Criminal Minds, and like a lot of a lot of like the serial killers in Criminal Minds, like they do like try to do political statements. So I guess it can be.
Okay, it can be. Sometimes they are explicitly making political statements. They'll carve messages into people, or you know, send notes. They can sometimes make political statement. That's a good point. Anybody else?
Terrorism.
Oh,
What was
Oh,
that?
sorry. I was gonna say terrorism is
Terror-
political violence.
And that's something that that Shell talks about in here in terms of like, okay, that turning point of 9/11 and the way we understand that kind of violence. Yeah. Okay. Mutually assured destruction has been argued that nuclear heads had kept. All right, and we'll talk about then the intersection between peace and violence, and how this idea that violence can bring peace. Can violence give us peace, do you think?
Yes.
Philosophical.
Violence can bring peace. Yes.
Oh, that
I don't
is
think
To an
we can have
extent, the
peace
problem-
without war.
I feel like the problem with using like, because let's say you have like an overpowering nation state, right? That does like have enough power to theoretically like they're so powerful that they can really stop anything. It still doesn't stop the poor and the weak from attempting violent actions to do uprisings. Because even if you can stop like the leaders of nation states who know like, oh, if we mess with these guys, we'll get in trouble. It still doesn't like stop like martyrs. And I think that's a big reflection of terrorism, and why, even though the US is so powerful, we still see terrorism happening domestically and foreign terrorism, because the people who feel weak and powerless, this is like the one way for them to feel powerful.
And notice though that it kind of, to explain it, you can have a general like answer to some of these questions, but then you also want to get into some of these specific settings. It depends. And I think that's for those of you who were thinking that at the beginning. I'm like, I was going to push you to be like, give me yes or no. But I'm like, the historical way of thinking is it depends. In one setting, it might be the case, in others not. But let's talk a little bit about religion. And because when we talk about peace and violence, Shell brings up religion as, you know, a lot of religions prohibit certain forms of violence. But religions, especially in here talking about Christianity, is not incompatible with violence. And that's something that religion actually had to define very clearly, because initially, you know, some of these ancient texts do make it very clear it's prohibited in the 10 Commandments. Certain kinds of violence is prohibited. So then how then do you engage in things like the crusade? right?
Because the other group that you don't like is believing in another religion and they consider you false and you want to push your religion and your truth to them.
Yeah, but and Jeremiah, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say it kind of, the reading mentioned like Catholic just war theory and that sort of thing. So it's like, you have precepts, and then you also, so you have like I guess like the basis of the religion, but in that you also have like an institution that sets dogma and that sort of thing, and then they kind of make rules to make because they're saying like in like this, and then they talk about like St. Augustine and like the city of God and the city of man, like, yeah, in the city of God, like, yeah, then yeah, live by the sword, die by the sword, it's great. But in like the fallen city of man, well, there's going to have to be violence. So then they come up with things like just war theory and, to justify the Crusades and things like that. So there's this kind of whole like, they exist in two separate planes and you kind of have to like figure out how to, basically work in the plane of like real life. And like the theory, I guess, is that like, you just have to take, you have to use force in like real life and that sort of thing, even if it does contradict like the precepts of your religion and your belief.
Yeah, like when you look at it, I'm like, a lot of us look at religion, and I'm like, that should be incompatible. Religion should not be in the business of justifying wars, but a whole theology emerged out of justifying it for it. So, and just for those of you that don't know, just war theory is coming out of a justification for the Crusades, right? What do you do when you're religiously, you have a law that says do not kill, but you have a war against kind of an enemy of a different religion, and what they came up with was just war theory. The short version of we could spend the whole semester talking about just war theory, but the short version, as Jeremiah was telling us here, is that it's a justification that sometimes war is okay. Basically, is what just war theory says, that sometimes it is okay, right? Even wars of aggression can sometimes be okay. So to defend yourself is okay, violence is okay, but also sometimes to be the aggressor can be okay, right? That it can be just. And then people got into defining, okay, what makes a war just, right? And what makes it okay, what makes it not okay, and then you get bogged down in all of that. But like, this is the ways in which religions have justified, where they've come with a theology, came up with a theology to justify it. So that's just one example. We could go through all the religions, but we don't have time for all of that. I really want to talk about, we were going to spend a lot of time in the late 19th century and then in the 20th century, right? And when you think of the major events of the 20th century, it's filled with violence, right? Not just the world wars, right? What else was happening in the 20th century that was violent? Colonialism. Yeah, so we're talking about the 1900s, by the way. I'm like, when I give centuries, sometimes I'll confuse people, but we're talking about 1900s, so 1900 till the year 2000. Colonialism, absolutely. What else?
Relevant to America, you see the civil rights movement. I mean, that's really important.
Absolutely. And we tend to think of the civil rights movement or associated with the technique of nonviolence, but not the nonviolence as a tactic. It required violence. It requires the opposing force being violent, right? And that the unjustness of that violence to be public. So it does require violence. What else happened in the 20th century?
We saw a lot of death related to like different nations trying out different political systems, like a lot of the communist revolutions and those sorts of things.
Absolutely, yeah. When we think about not just like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, up in all over Latin America and different places, this kind of political violence. Decolonization, though, was also a key element of the 20th century, right? Colonies, places fighting for their independence. And all of that required violence, or it used violence. It was using violence to overthrow colonial power. Anything peaceful, though? Anything nice happened in the 20th century?
Oh, we had the civil rights movement.
But we already said that that required violence. So
there's some peace.
Any peace?
I mean, the Berlin Wall came down. That's what I can think about.
Yeah, didn't that require though people getting, tearing it down? Isn't that a kind of violence? Maybe not. I'm gonna see. They mentioned the Berlin. He does mention the Berlin Wall as like a moment of peace. That's true. He does mention it. All right, I'll take it. Gandhi. But again, when we talk about like Gandhi and like Martin Luther King Jr., we're talking about nonviolence tactics, but that required violence. It was a way of like you when you participate in a nonviolent movement, you have to be ready to also be hurt. Those people, and that was one of the hardest things to do, to convince people to participate and know that they were going to get arrested, that they were going to get hurt. Kyra, were you gonna?
Was influenza happening? So wasn't it like, you got the vaccine, yay, or
All right, no.
That's the thing?
Yes, medical advancements, right?
Medical
So
advancement, yeah.
one of the things we'll talk about. Oh, someone brought up the internet. Well, even though it feels violent at times, the internet. Yes. So these kind of technologies that helped preserve life and help advance human life, the fact that we can live longer than people beforehand, right? And a lot of that technology actually gets developed over the course of war, right? Like they actually develop techniques of preserving life because of war. It's really interesting. Modernization, industrialization. Thank you, Gloria. there is lots of violence. Once we get to, the world wars, I'm gonna try to talk about peace and the way that, people did oppose the world wars, and the way that the horrors of war led to peace movements. Veterans spearheaded a lot of peace movements. Right? And a lot of pacifist organizations emerged out of it, and out of veterans, out of people who had fought and experienced war, wanting peace. We have attempts at establishing global peace via the UN, right? And via like trying to make things like genocide. And now it didn't work, and that none of those things ended, right? But then let me poke you a little bit about what about the 21st century? So from the year 2000 to today, what do you think? Do you think it's violence? If you had to pick between violence and peace, what do you think our world is defined by?
Violence.
Ricky says violence.
I say
Yeah,
violence
Ricky says violence.
because literally within 2000, the year after, we got 9/11 and we led to like the Afghanistan war for years.
Yeah, we did.
I mean, through a world perspective, it seems like everything's kind of calmed down. Recently, Arabic relations with the Jews is kind of, they're on speaking terms now. Before that wasn't possible.
And
in general,
shaky though, very shaky.
Yeah. Without looking at America, everything else is kind of, I mean, it's not good, but I think it's better.
It's difficult. Violence invoked by racism has been a key element of the 21st century. Yeah. So it's a little bit tricky, right? Especially the way we look at it. I will actually tell you, none of you're all thinking in a kind of a global war terms, and that's totally fine. And actually, since, halfway through the 20th century, crime around the world has gone down. A lot of times in the news, if all you do is watch the news and keep up with that kind of stuff, you think, man, this is such a violent world, but it's actually gone down. The amount of crimes and violent crimes committed statistically are down and have been down. Even in times when people are freaking out about it, it's down, right? But I think there's a difference between maybe the reality of certain things like that being less, and then the experience of it. A lot of it really is more about how are we experiencing our world. For us, in the middle of a pandemic, political change, a lot of instability, it feels like a violent world, right? So telling you that statistically there's a lot less crime and a lot less death, it doesn't feel meaningful when the experience of it is different.
I think the reading makes a really interesting point, because like you were just saying, like a lot of us are viewing violence as like kind of global war and just like war in general and that sort of thing. But the reading even kind of makes this point that like like war has evolved because we have like new weapons and nuclear weapons and that sort of thing, and like war has evolved into annihilation. And so this quick part from the reading, it says the means of annihilation paradoxically puts their predecessors in a predicament that was better described by the precepts of Jesus by those than those of Augustus. So he's saying through the creation of nuclear arsenals, it became literally true that users of the sword would die by the sword. So it's like now, because we have like weapons of annihilation, there's also, it kind of like makes us a little more peaceful when it comes to war, because we know like everything will pretty much be gone like that, like the minute we decide to like use them. Like it kind of like tames us a little bit.
Yeah, and I wonder if the rest of you agree that like with the, like humans develop these bombs, right, capable of mass and total destruction. The U.S. used it against Japan at the end of World War II, and then everybody developed them. We've continued to develop them and improve all of the ways in which we kill each other, but we haven't used it again. Right, the Cold War, from this point of view, right, kind of led to a moment of like, oh shit. We are very good at killing each other, and we can kill each other like that with the push of a button. And so we have also, that has scared us into, well, shit, maybe we shouldn't. Not that way, right? Not using these bombs, right? We could take out countries, we can take out like entire portions of the earth, right, by dropping bombs. But we have also chosen not to do that, right? Because let's say, you know, we drop these bombs against Russia, right? Russia can do the same. They'll retaliate. And then where do we end up? Everybody dead. And so that scares us into, well, all right, we're not going to use it, right? So instead we improved some of the other technology of killing people. Right, we made guns and other kinds of and gases and biological warfare. We came up with other ways that are not so total, but still very, very dramatic. But yeah, so what do you think? Do you think, do you like that way of looking at it, that we scared ourselves into stopping for a second? Or do you think it's a temporary?
I think there's a big cultural shift because when you look at the way that people used to use weaponry, I mean, there was this idea that after the bombs were developed, the people that worked on the Manhattan Project, a lot of them were figured like, oh, they're going to use this just like they use every other weapon, right? But we didn't, and there's this shift where like it becomes like, oh, we're changing the way we're doing this. Like we're not testing out our all-out weapons and stuff like that. So I feel like there is a change caused by the bombs. That's a cultural shift in the thinking of the people who run these things. Because if you gave nuclear bombs to Hitler, I mean, come on, you know what would happen. But you know, if you gave nuclear bombs to even someone like Kim Jong-un, he knows what's going to happen if he tries to use them. So, you know, these crazy leaders are different now because of this shift.
Yeah, and we pay close attention to how they develop it and how they try to develop these things. Okay, let me. Anybody else? I'm trying to make sure.
Sorry, you can go, man. No worries.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I feel like when talking about like the nuclear bombs, I think it's countries who have them that are safer, right? The countries who don't have them are the countries that kind of get screwed over, right? Because you could look at like Iran, they'll get sanctioned. North Korea, they'll get sanctioned. Venezuela, you know, all the countries who don't have nuclear weapons, they'll just get picked on by countries who do have them.
And there is.
Oh yeah, and then earlier too, and it's kind of the same thing, I guess, where you do kind of need violence to prevent violence in a way too. It's kind of like when you're at school and there's a bully, you know, eventually you're gonna have to punch them, you know, and so to that point too, you know, violence does kind of stop violence in the same way.
Okay. And the other thing actually that I want to bring up is that in terms of like global conflict, like a lot of like colonial military occupation of places ended in the 20th century. There's still a lot of it going on, but a lot of it did end. But what we also saw in the second half of the 20th century was that global powers got really good at controlling other nation states through other means that were not necessarily military, right? Through economic means, right? You loan a country a shit ton of money and now you basically owe them, right? Or you become their main trade partner. And now if they don't do what you want, you can wreck their economy. Right? Like we became very good at figuring out different ways of exerting power over between global powers and nation states. Capitalism. Yes. So there are different ways then in which, and for countries that are being economically, controlled, that creates violence for them, right? If it feels like a violent, that's why a lot of people that like to theorize about, come up with these theories of violence, say it's about power. It's a power dynamics of exerting power over someone else or one group over another group, right? That it's a power issue, and we'll look at different ways in which these power relationships come into conflict. Odalis, what did you?
Oh no, sorry, it's because my camera went on.
No, okay, no problem. All right, a couple of other points I want to make. Well, at least one more point I want to make here is about agency. Shell does not talk about this, but to me as a historian, this is one of the most important lenses through which we can look at history, right? That we never ever want to say that something was predetermined. Right? Not in history, we don't believe anything was predetermined. Right? If believed, like, of course, World War was going to break out, then you take responsibility away from the people who actually made decisions. Right? People made decisions that led to things happening, that had consequences, and for that, we like to say that every individual human being has agency. Right? That we have the power to shape how violence develops, it intensifies, how it might shift, right? That we have agency. Agency is basically the short definition of it is the capacity to act. We all have a choice to make. Now, that doesn't mean we always have any good choices. Sometimes, humans feel like they have very limited choices, but that still means you have a choice. Sometimes it's just shitty choices, right? But we have choices, right? But society does put these constraints, right? It puts constraints, but the ability to choose is always there, and that becomes harder to think of when we get into some of the specifics. We want to say things like, well, it's inherent. It's always there. Of course, this person was going to act violently, and I really want you to try to not fall into that trap of making things predetermined, right? Because we want to analyze, okay, what was the choice? What were the choices here? What was the setting that led to particular choices down this path? And that makes it more interesting. Honestly, it'll make it much more interesting for us to really dig into some of these historical contexts and understand why something happened and how it could even happen, right? So that's one of the most important elements of the way we study history that I think is different in other fields, where you're trying to understand maybe more of how predetermined elements can affect choices. Right? But let's see. Do you think? Let's then talking about something. Do you think peace is possible? Do you think an end of violence is possible?
I don't think so.
Oh,
Not so
very
long as it's profitable.
pessimistic. As long as it's profitable. Oh, see, and now you're bringing in all the complications, right? It's all the complications of violence. Anybody want to say yes? It's possible.
I think we can get close. We can get almost there.
It's human nature. But okay, Naya, you said no, it's human nature, but you're not being violent right now. Why are you being violent right now?
Um, I'm not being violent right now because like nothing's invoking me to be violent. But of course, like situation is natural and it occurs always. So like when a situation does occur, it's like human nature to react in an aggressive or violent way, as we see in like animals. Like when animals like have situations with each other, they fight each other. We're also animals, so the same thing happens with us.
Yeah, but we create some situations in which like it's better for us to make the choice to not be violent. So why can't we do that? Why can't we work in creating social, political,
Because it's our instinct. So like even if like we try to, like it's always gonna be there because it's our instinct. Like we could try and like control ourselves, and like we are really good at controlling ourselves, but it is part of our instinct. So like that's why like we're not perfect. Like we do have situations like when we do get violent and aggressive.
I think it's also psychological.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot who was speaking, but what she was saying, that it's, you know, a natural response, and, you know, we're really good at hiding our aggression or our violence. Maybe that's also what makes like serial killers and criminals more interesting, I guess, to people, because they're doing things that we don't normally do anymore, because, you know, we're humans. We're too good for the natural instinct that causes violence like other animals. So I always thought about that, because I really do think that it's a natural instinct. I don't think you can ever truly take away violence, because if you're in a death, it's like if you're facing death with a person, you're not just gonna let them kill you. At least I don't think you're gonna.
I'll come back to that in a second, but Odalis?
Yeah.
Oh, I was saying that it's also like it can be psychological as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know, I know some people who have like, I guess, what is it called, like psychosis, I guess you could say, or like they have a break, and you know, some people who, I don't know, I guess you can just say they become violent, and it's just because that's how, like, that's what their brain is telling them. Their brain is telling them something else like is going on. Like for example, people with PTSD who come back from like war and stuff, like they have like situations here that make them think they're still at war, and it makes them go violent.
Okay, and this actually relates to what Susanna is saying in the chat, though. Like, you know, that, you know, but what socially and legally, we've decided that, you know, somebody having a psychological or physical predisposition for violence is not good enough excuse. Right? We said it doesn't. You maybe psychologically or physically something caused you to be violent, and that's not good enough. You're still going to jail. Right? We said that's not a good excuse. So we have set rules. We do kind of manage, right? Even if that is some of that violence is instinctual, we have decided that it's not a good enough excuse, and that we have social restraints, that we have choices to make for a reason. We'll fight about this some more. We'll fight about this some more, because I'm like, I want to push against seeing things as just like inherent. I'm like, things are not just inherent, but it's easier once we look at particular context to look at, okay, but what was the situation here, and then we can judge and say, is that okay or is not okay. Right. But all right, since I see many of you are in the it's inherent, it's never going away camp, anybody not in that camp, anybody consider themselves a pacifist or close to being believing in pacifism? No, did all my pacifist students left and went and took a different, they did not take a class called the history of violence?
I feel like unless violence is necessary to stop a situation from occurring, then it's okay. Other than that, if it's unnecessary, then walk away. I don't know. I've been to the point where people have yelled at my face and it just, just smile. Okay. What's the point?
And it might take a lot of control, but it's possible. Okay, all right. Yeah, Kyra?
Professor, I also feel like if you feel like you could stop a situation for a person, I don't believe in just standing there and watching someone just get hurt because you're a pacifist. Like that doesn't make
that
any sense
complicates
to me,
things.
because then it's like, now to me you're accessory, because you just watched this person get beat down or whatever, and you probably had the means to stop it, especially if you have the means to stop the situation. So
Cannon, were you gonna add?
Now I was going to add to the pacifism. I don't know if I consider myself a pacifist. I try not to get into fights. I haven't been into fights, but I usually stop them if I see them. So violence isn't inherent in yourself if you choose to avoid conflicts, I guess.
Okay, all right. I like at least some of this. Then I will have to be the voice of pacifism for the, or if any pacifist is hiding out here in the Zoom, I will say that I don't know if I'm 100% a pacifist, but I'm probably as close as it gets without fully adapting the definition. Sometimes you don't know. The reason I don't 100% call myself a pacifist is because sometimes you don't know how you're going to react in a situation until you're in it. And I feel like I've been lucky that I've never been in a situation where I've had to use violence. I did once push a girl when she was on her skates, who was being real mean to me. I suppose that was that was my violence coming out. But like and it's so weird because I'm like, I love studying world wars. I love studying colonialism, serial killers, and all of that. And yet I'm like, I'm pretty much a pacifist. And I think it's possible to be one, to have those things, and to still want to explore and to study the the history of violence. So I'm like, if nobody else brings it up, I will be pushing you all with some pacifist thoughts, and some alternative ways of thinking, right? People have imagined different kinds of non-violent worlds. And I think even when we think violence is inherent, a lot of us at least want to push towards more peace and less conflict, less war, less of that stuff. The opposite of violence reactions. Yeah, even I'm like, I would always shock in school when teachers would ask like, well, but what if somebody is gonna hurt a family member or do something? And I'm like, sorry, family member, I can't see myself. I just can't imagine it. But I've never been in that situation, and I don't know if I would actually react or not, or how I would react. But we can control ourselves, but not others. And then legally, right? How we ourselves comport ourselves, and then the legal definitions that we agree to are different.
Being a pacifist is kind of difficult. I mean, you could agree that you could support the idea that, you don't want to cause any violence or hurt anyone, that violence isn't necessary, and like peace is great. But it's very difficult to stay consistent in that, especially when people start asking hard questions. I think the most shining example of being a pacifist is that soldier Desmond T. Doss, who served in World War II. There's a movie about him, Hacksaw Ridge. He was a pacifist, and he served as like a medic during World War II. But he went through some pretty hard times where he really had to stick to his principles and not kill anyone during combat in like World War II. So it's possible to be like 100% pure pacifist, but it takes a lot, I think.
Take a lot. Yeah. Okay. I was trying to end on a good note. You guys keep bringing back the bad notes, so I'm gonna blame you guys for all the negativity in this space. All right, we will end here. Let me stop the recording. So.